Welcome to the African American Workshop and Lecture Series. We thank you most sincerely for joining us tonight for another wonderful presentation in the University of Oregon's African American Workshop and Lecture Series. As you will recall, the series is one of the 12 demands of the Black Student Task Force, and the purpose of the series is to facilitate a better understanding of and appreciation for the vast contributions that Black people have made to our country and our world. Tonight's speaker will explore the fascinating concept of global Blackness, and we welcome you to use the chat function to pose questions and comments. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming President Michael Schill, who will introduce tonight's speaker. President Schill.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yvette. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome all of you to tonight's African American Workshop and Lecture Series event. Today's lecture features Professor Emmanuel Akyeampong, a distinguished historian with an expertise in African and African American cross-cultural studies. His talk is going to examine the changing relations between Africans and African Americans during the past half century, and how immigration from Africa to the United States has created an international community around global Blackness. Now, this lecture comes at an important time for our university. At the start of this academic year, we launched the University of Oregon's Black Studies program. It has historical roots dating back to 1968 and protests by the university's Black Student Union. The program gives students the opportunity to learn about and better understand the Black experience in America, and also join with scholars in questioning what is at the center of the power structures we live within today. Tonight's lecture complements these efforts and provides an opportunity not only for our students, but also for our entire university and Eugene community to deepen our understandings of the realities of our shared history. Now, I'd like to thank Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Yvette Alexasenso, and the entire staff of the Division of Equity and Inclusion for facilitating tonight's lectures and this series. It's been a remarkable quarter so far, and I'm looking forward to next quarter. Now, Professor Akyeampong's research focuses on West African history, the African diaspora, political economy, and trade. Over the past several years, he has written numerous publications that have focused on the cultural, political, and social life of Ghana, and is the author of, quote, Drink Power and Cultural Change, A Social History of Alcohol in Ghana, 1800 to Recent Times. He played an instrumental role in shaping the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and is the current faculty director of the Harvard University Center for African Studies. Professor Akyeampong graduated from the University of Ghana with degrees in history and religions, and he earned his master's degree and PhD from Wake Forest University and the University of Virginia, respectively. After completing his PhD, he joined the history faculty at Harvard, where he currently serves as a joint professor of history and African American studies. He was appointed Loeb Harvard College professor in 2005 for this distinguished teaching, and he's a faculty associate for the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He's a board member of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute and the Oppenheimer Faculty Director at Harvard University Center for African Studies. So with all of those different obligations and an active research agenda, we are so pleased he could join us tonight. So I'd like to welcome him and welcome all of you to this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Schill, for the introduction. Let me start off by thanking all who have made it possible for me to virtually visit the University of Oregon today, to spend time with students, staff, and faculty, and to speak in the African American Workshop and Lecture Series. My sincere gratitude to President Schill, to Provost Patrick Phillips, to Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Yvette Alexa Senso, the Black Students Task Force, and the various groups and individuals I have met with over the course of the day. Before I share my screen, let me give you a quick sense of where I want to take you in this lecture. During the colonial period, Africans who went overseas usually went to the colonial metropole, France, Britain, Portugal, and Belgium. A few came to the United States to study, including Nnamdi Azikiwe and Kwame Nkrumah, who both attended Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and went on to become heads of states in West Africa. On independence, African countries were attracted to the United States' aid and technical support, but few had substantive engagement with the African American community. Over the half century or so covered by my lecture, this would change, driven by African immigration to the United States. As a second generation of African immigrants identified more closely with African Americans in a racialized America, the lines begin to blur between the old African diaspora and the new African diaspora. I will examine responses of African governments to these developments, using Ghana as an example. I will interrogate how violence and economic exploitation around the Atlantic has made meaningful the concept of global Blackness and its implications for a Black identity. So I will share my screen now. Okay. So my lecture has 6 parts, and to the right of the panel, you see the sections or the parts of the lecture. I will try and squeeze my lecture into 40 minutes to give us time for Q&A. I will only read sections of my paper and hope that the Q&A would offer an opportunity to revisit areas glossed over or not discussed. So we go to the introduction. In July 1964, Malcolm X traveled to Cairo for the second summit of the recently established Organization of African Unity, then comprised of 35 independent African states. His objective was to seek their support for the US civil rights movement and to have the organization pass a resolution that condemned the blatant racial discrimination against African Americans in the United States. At its founding summit in 1963, the OAU had passed a strongly worded resolution against racial discrimination in apartheid South Africa. Malcolm X hoped the OAU would expand its remit to embrace people of African descent in the diaspora. Malcolm X was discouraged by the lack of interest among the African heads of state who had enough problems on their table with their new nation states, until Julius Nyerere, the Pan-Africanist president of Tanzania, moved to support Malcolm X's petition and got other African heads of state to join in. Nyerere agreed with Malcolm X that the fight for the liberation of Africans and people of African descent in the United States were connected. The result was Resolution 15-1, Racial Discrimination in the United States of America, which, while acknowledging the progress made with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, indicted the United States for failing to combat racism, noting that not much has been achieved in this sphere since the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years ago. In May 2020, policemen in Minneapolis publicly assaulted an African-American man, George Floyd, one white policeman kneeling on his neck for over 8 minutes. George Floyd died, sparking widespread protests across American cities and in many African cities under the Black Lives Matter movement. The African Union, the body that had replaced the Organization of African Unity, issued a statement strongly condemning the murder of George Floyd and rejecting the continuing discriminatory practices against Black citizens. In the half century or so between Malcolm X's visit to Cairo in 1964 to lobby the OAU and 2020, significant changes had occurred to transform Africa's relations with people of African descent in the United States and the diaspora. A key turn in African and African-American relations after the 1960s has been the increasing immigration of Africans to the United States. While only 43,000 Africans immigrated to the United States between 1951 and the 1970s, by 2018, the number of immigrants from Africa living in the United States had reached 2.4 million, with sub-Saharan Africans making up 2.1 million, or 84% of the total. This was almost as many Africans as had immigrated to Britain and France, the two major former colonial powers in Africa. The initial impetus for this immigration to the US had been graduate study from the 1950s, with economic decline in Africa providing a subsequent push from the 1980s. The result is that the African immigrant population in the United States represents one of the most educated constituencies in America. One of the early discernible effects of this first generation of immigrants who were strongly transnational was in remittances. As remittances from Africans abroad rose from $9.1 billion in 1990 to $22.5 billion in 2005, and almost $40 billion in 2010. One can understand why in 2003, the African Union declared the African diaspora as Africa's sixth region. As talk shifted from brain drain to brain circulation, African governments explored innovative ways to tap into the professional skills of this new diaspora in lieu of repatriation. A second feature of sub-Saharan African immigrants in the United States is the high percentage of naturalization, comprising more than half. Several African governments moved to incorporate their dispersed transnationals into their political economy by passing dual citizenship acts, a feature that was rare in the early decades of independence. This first generation held tightly onto their African nationalities and ethnicities. The story with the second generation of African immigrants, those born or raised as children in the United States, is a little more complicated. They have continued the trajectory of their parents in the pursuit of higher education. This second generation identifies as both American and African. In America's racialized society, they align with African Americans and struggle against the racial denigration of Blackness. While the fears of the first generation parents and African governments that the second generation would have minimal ties to Africa have been disproved, they have pursued their transnationalism in rather different ways from their parents. I argue in this lecture that their closer alignment with African Americans, their identification with Blackness, their close ties to young adults of their generation in Africa, and the patronage of the creative and performing arts on both sides of the Atlantic by this younger generation have given currency to a conception of global Blackness. At the center of global Blackness is the awareness that the global operation of empire and racial capitalism have created structures and systems that have discriminated against people of color the world over. Slavery, new slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, all are now connected in the understanding of the younger generation in insightful ways and in their articulation of the arts. A lightning rod in global Blackness has been the pervasiveness of violence on both sides of the Atlantic, a visceral reality that binds Black communities around the Atlantic and galvanizes global support for movements like Black Lives Matter. In response to these important developments, African governments have expanded their engagement of the new diaspora to include the old diaspora. It is against this changing context that the African Union would issue a strong statement denouncing the murder of the African American George Floyd in Minneapolis. In a recent article gauging pan-ethnicity among African Americans and children of Black immigrants, Onoso Imwajeni wondered whether recent events and social movements like the Black Lives Matter movement would strengthen racial solidarity and belief in a linked fate among an increasingly diverse Black population in the United States. I would argue that we are actually already witnessing a reimagining of Black global solidarities in ways that transcend its local dynamics in the United States. The question is whether this development opens up room for the redefinition of the meaning of Blackness in more affirming ways. We go to the second part and look at African independence, the African American question, and early African immigration. Independence in sub-Saharan Africa from the late 1950s overlapped with the presidencies of Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. American leaders were not ignorant that global influence in Africa could not be divorced from the civil rights movement. Eisenhower, who aligned closely with the interests of European colonial powers and white settlers in Africa, cared little about the newly emerging African states. He described 1960, the year in which 17 African countries gained independence, as a destructive hurricane. African Americans welcomed with enthusiasm Ghana's independence in 1957. Prominent African Americans and Caribbean Africans who attended Ghana's independence celebrations in March 1957 included Norman Manley, who later became Prime Minister of Jamaica, UN official and Nobel laureate Ralph Bunche, Martin Luther King and his wife Coretta, Lucille Armstrong, representing her husband Louis Armstrong, labor leaders and educators from historically Black universities like Howard University and Lincoln University. Indeed, it was at the Ghana celebrations that Martin Luther King Jr. and Vice President Richard Nixon would meet each other for the first time, and you see them in the top photo with their wives. "I'm very glad to meet you here," King remarked to Nixon, no doubt pleased by the irony of the encounter. "But I want you to come to visit us in Alabama, where we are seeking the same kind of freedom the Gold Coast is celebrating." Nixon promptly invited King to Washington for a meeting. On his return to his congregation in Alabama, King's first sermon was entitled "The Birth of a New Nation," in which he shared his reflections on Ghana and expressed the hope that African Americans by the hundreds and thousands would emigrate to Ghana to lend their technical assistance in the building of Africa's first Black independent nation state. Nkrumah had attended college at Lincoln University and graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1930s and the 1940s. He had met civil rights leaders like C.L.R. James and W.E.B. Du Bois on his regular visits then to Harlem. Many African Americans responded to Nkrumah's and King's call to come and assist the work of nation building in Ghana. Du Bois himself would assume Ghanaian citizenship in 1961 and live out his late years in Ghana, where he and his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, are buried. The photo below is Du Bois's 95th birthday party that Nkrumah held for him. Du Bois is on the extreme right, Shirley Du Bois Graham, and Kwame Nkrumah. The presence of diplomatic representatives of these new African nations in Washington, D.C., and the United Nations in New York inserted them in a racialized America and created some embarrassing moments for the United States government. Take the example of Ghana's finance minister, Komla Gbedema, who, while driving through Delaware in October 1957, stopped at a Howard Johnson restaurant and was told by the waitress and manager that as colored people, he and his group could not sit inside, but had to take their purchase out. Gbedema tried to explain unsuccessfully that he was the finance minister of the independent nation state of Ghana. But in America, Black is Black. The diplomatic fallout over this incident led to President Eisenhower inviting Gbedema to the White House for breakfast, and to later extending an invitation for a head of state visit to the United States. African diplomats of the newly independent countries found themselves excluded from appropriate housing befitting their rank because of segregated housing. White landlords denied them rental houses and apartments. This became a sore point for Senator John F. Kennedy, who chaired the newly formed Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee for Africa from 1959 to 1960. African countries that were not familiar with racial politics in the United States were thus given their introduction to race relations in America. When Kennedy became president in 1961, he moved away from the Eisenhower policy that supported European colonial powers in Africa and aligned more with the aspirations of African nationalist governments. In the short tenure as the 35th President of the United States from January 20, 1961 to November 22, 1963, Kennedy hosted 28 African heads of state at the White House. The presence of African diplomatic missions brought an increasing familiarity with American higher education, and the work of organizations like the African American Institute, a private non-political American organization founded in 1953, strengthened educational ties between Africa and the United States. Its educational programs included the placement of American teachers in African secondary schools and colleges in cooperation with African authorities. It also administered scholarships to African students in the United States. Other initiatives, such as the Teachers in West Africa program, sponsored by Hershey Foods Corporation, a major purchaser of cocoa from Ghana and Nigeria, and administered by Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, sent 238 American teachers to secondary schools, polytechnics, and universities in Ghana and Nigeria between 1962 and 1972. It cannot be understated how these initiatives directed West African interest to American higher education. The result was the increasing numbers of Africans who came to the United States for college and graduate school. Between 1951 and the 1970s, over 43,000 Africans immigrated to the United States. We now move to the post-1980s, where increased economic decline and political instability will see an expansion in African immigration. Economic and political promise in newly independent Africa meant that Africans who studied abroad were eager to return home to assist in nation building. But already in the 1960s, there were ominous signs of political unrest, military adventurism, and authoritarian rule. In just 1963, the attempts at assassination and military coups included Senegal, Ghana, Mali, Togo, the Ivory Coast, Chad, Benin, and more. The Nigerian Civil War from 1967 to 1970 deepened the sense of gloom. In the 1960s, the first full decade of African independence, military coups overthrew 17 governments across the continent. Politically, the 1960s was a messy decade. By the 1970s, the expectations of economic development, buoyed by modernization theory and development economics, had been tempered by sober reality. The 1980s was the abyss, referred to as Africa's lost decade, as African countries fell heavily into debt. Whereas Ghana had been the only country in sub-Saharan Africa to access an International Monetary Fund's stabilization program in the 1970s, between 1980 and 1984, 33 of sub-Saharan Africa's 48 countries had received adjustment loans from the IMF and the World Bank. Africa had entered the era of structural adjustment. These developments served as a major push for African immigration. The African immigrant population from sub-Saharan Africa in the United States, which stood at 130,000 in 1980, increased to 265,000 in 1990, 691,000 in 2000, a little over 1.3 million in 2010, and a little over 2 million in 2018. Other factors in the United States served as pull factors. The first major US immigration policy to open the doors to African immigrants was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The 1965 Act abolished an earlier quota system based on national origin and introduced a new policy that privileged the reuniting of families and attracting skilled labor to the United States. The result was a shift away from Europe as the major source of immigrants to the US, to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. A second important policy was the Diversity Immigrant Visa Program, also known as the Green Card Lottery, introduced by the Immigration Act of 1990. As the number of African immigrants in the United States and in Canada, Europe, and Australia grew, the impact in Africa was seen in remittances this first generation sent home. Let me use the example of Ghana to illustrate key developments in relations between the Ghanaian government, Ghanaian immigrants abroad, and African Americans from the 1990s to the present. The government of Ghana views Ghanaian immigrants abroad, the new diaspora, and African Americans, the old diaspora, as two important constituencies to court, but for years pursued strategies that viewed these two constituencies as separate. When the Ghana government has reached out to the African diaspora, it has usually been through the prism of tourism and cultural festivals like the Pan-African Festival or PANAFest, which the government started in 1996. Outreach to African Americans has privileged roots tourism and foregrounded the slave castles at Elmina and Cape Coast, two World Heritage Monuments. And you have the photo above is Cape Coast Castle. That below is a side view of Elmina Castle. Ghana boasts of the densest concentration of European fortifications in tropical Africa from the era of the Atlantic slave trade. African Americans who seek a physical connection to West Africa, to the history of the slave trade, who would like to engage sites of memory, go to Ghana, even if their ancestors may not have embarked for the New World from the coast of Ghana. To encourage African Americans to visit Ghana and to consider investing in the country, the Immigration Act 573 of 2000 extended to them the right of abode to facilitate their travel to and from the country without hindrance. But this was not citizenship. In the 1990s, the number of Ghanaian immigrants in the US grew prolifically. It was reported that Ghanaians in the US remitted annually to Ghana in the 1990s between $250 and $350 million. The economic significance of the Ghanaian community in the US merited a trip in 1996 by the Presidential Advisor on Government Affairs, Paul Victor Obing. Though the Ghanaian economy was not doing badly, the government sought a much-needed boost for Ghana's economic recovery program through private investment and technical expertise, and it viewed Ghanaians in the United States as the key constituency to approach. In 1996, the year of Obing's visit to the United States, remittances from Ghanaians in the United States amounted to $400 million, compared to foreign direct investment of $126 million. The Ghanaian professionals Obing met in the United States highlighted that dual citizenship would be an important insurance for them if they were to invest in Ghana. The recent US policy of putting expiration dates on green cards had encouraged many Ghanaians to acquire US citizenship, and Ghana did not allow for dual citizenship. The importance of this first generation of Ghanaian immigrants to the Ghanaian government is evidenced by the fact that in 1996, the Ghanaian constitution was amended to permit dual citizenship. The economic importance of the Ghanaian diaspora only increased with the 21st century. In 2001, Ghanaian remittances from abroad reached $517 million, making remittances the third major source of foreign exchange after cocoa and gold. It is not surprising that one of the first major events of the new Patriotic Party government under President John A. Kufuor was to organize a homecoming summit in July 2001 in Accra for Ghanaians abroad to encourage them to invest their capital and skills in Ghana's economic development. In 2003, Ghanaian remittances reached a staggering $1.9 billion, displacing cocoa and gold as the country's leading source of foreign currency. The government continued the two-tiered approach to the old and new diaspora, but developments had begun to blur the lines between the old and new diasporas. The second generation of African immigrants had entered the scene, and African governments were unsure of their commitment to transnationalism because of their looser ties to African nationalities and ethnicities. They worried that the second generation would consider themselves American, specifically African American, with no strong links to their parents' home countries. We move to the section of being Black in the United States. By 2018, African immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa numbered about 2.1 million in the United States. While the demographics underscored a high level of education among African immigrants compared to the foreign-born population. The period from the mid-1990s has also seen the entry of thousands of African refugees from war-torn countries such as Liberia, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC. Liberian immigrants represented 4.2%, or 85,000 of the number of immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa in 2018. Between 2016 and 2018, Congolese from DRC comprised the largest contingent of refugees from Africa to the US. The refugee immigrants differed in sociological profile from the highly educated professional Africans from Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ethiopia that had come to characterize African immigration. Writing on second-generation Liberian immigrants in Staten Island, New York, who had been born in America to refugee parents or had been brought to the US as child refugees, Bernadette Ludwig pointed out that these parents were mostly uneducated, and children who had spent time with their parents in refugee camps had had their education disrupted. In the United States, refugee children were placed in school grades according to their age and not based on academic assessment, and many dropped out of school unable to cope with the academic work. Stigmatized as refugees who sponged off the welfare system and embarrassed by parents who barely spoke English and worked mainly as home health aides, an occupation that was denigrated. Second-generation Liberians in Staten Island were eager to distance themselves from their African origins. They sought to embrace an African American identity. In the United States, African Americans are categorized as Black, discounting the important national and ethnic identities that mark the 54 or so African countries. Imua Jenny points to multiple studies that show that Black immigrants and their children are contesting being ascribed a Black racial identity that conflates ethnicity and race, that erases their ethnicity and makes them indistinguishable from African Americans. Indeed, Black in America is a diverse category. Consequently, the response to the label of Blackness among African Americans has been varied and sometimes ambivalent. Let us use second-generation Nigerians and Liberians to illustrate two different but not unconnected responses. For second-generation Nigerians with a highly educated professional parents who held tightly to their Nigerian nationality and ethnic identities, being Nigerian and American has fused in novel ways. Nigerian parents often taught their American-born or raised children their indigenous languages, attuned them to the cultural sensibilities of being Nigerian, and shared their histories. I have taught at Harvard for almost 3 decades and cannot count the number of research papers second-generation Igbo Americans have written in my classes on the Biafran Civil War, internalizing the moral pain of a civil war they did not personally experience. It is not surprising that one of the most read novels of the acclaimed Nigerian-American author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Half of a Yellow Sun, is on the Biafran Civil War. And in her best-selling novel, Americana, Chimamanda Adichie, through the words of her female character, Ifemelu, sums up the process of racialization in America. And I quote, "Dear non-American Black, when you make the choice to come to America, you become Black. Stop arguing. Stop saying, I am Jamaican or I am American. America doesn't care. So what if you weren't Black in your country? You are in America now." Quotation closed. In the face of racial discrimination in America, Imwajeni concludes that second-generation college-educated Nigerian Americans took on a Black racial identity and exhibited racial solidarity with all other Black people. Tunji, a Nigerian American who attended a historically Black college, informed Imwajeni, and I quote him, "I don't think of myself as African or African American. I'm just Black." This acceptance of Blackness by second-generation Nigerian immigrants did not obviate their class and cultural sensibilities. On the other hand, our second-generation Liberian immigrants in Staten Island, New York, who exert themselves to assimilate into an African American identity and to push away their Liberian refugee origins, which vitiates their acceptance into Black American society. Economically and socially disadvantaged, second-generation Liberians in Staten Island are not interested in practicing transnationalism, of being connected to a Liberia their parents prefer not to speak about. Ludwig notes that, and I quote, "The vast majority of second-generation Liberian Americans struggle to actively embrace a Liberian identity. This is especially the case when they are between the ages of 6 and 22. Many felt that being Liberian is only associated with negative stereotypes," quotation closed. The outbreak of Ebola in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea in 2014 did not help, as the Liberian community in Staten Island came under heavy suspicion, young ones even being discouraged from attending school by their teachers for fear that they would be sources of contagion. As second-generation African immigrants identified increasingly with Black America, they began to learn more about Black American history and culture, exploring subjects that had been considered anathema in their parents' generation back in Africa. As an undergraduate at the University of Ghana in the early 1980s, almost nothing was taught on the history of slavery and the slave trade. Today, it is a welcome and pleasant development that one of the most acclaimed sagas on slavery, slave trade, and their legacies, connecting Ghana and the United States over 8 generations, is written by a second-generation Ghanaian American, Ya Jesse, entitled Homegoing. Second-generation African immigrants are exploring African American and African histories and cultures in ways that their parents were perhaps not equipped or interested in pursuing. It has brought African immigrants and African Americans much closer under the shared identity of Blackness, with important implications on both sides of the Atlantic. We are heading to the end of our lecture. Black Lives Matter, African Arts and Global Blackness. The Black Lives Matter movement has had resonance not only in America, but also in Africa. The shared identity of Blackness and racial discrimination in America that does not discern differences in the Black constituency means that police violence is directed indiscriminately against African Americans and African immigrants. Consider the example of Amadou Diallo, a Guinean immigrant who was shot 41 times by New York police officers in February 1999. It is clear that it made no difference to the police officers whether Amadou Diallo was an African immigrant or an African American. He was Black. Parallel to the history of racial violence in America is a long history of violence in Africa that connects the period of slavery and the slave trade, colonialism, and authoritarian rule under post-colonial governments. A landmark study by Rosalind Shaw on Sierra Leone showed how this lengthy history of violence is connected in the ritual memory of Sierra Leoneans, and how contemporary political violence serves as a mnemonic that conjures this violent past. Crawford Young has noted how violence was an integral part of the colonial state in Africa. One of the key paradoxes of the African colonial state was that it was forged both on political and racial difference, making it not dissimilar to racial violence in America. Decolonization and African independence, often rapidly attained, barely implanted fragile graftings of a constitutional polity onto the robust trunk of colonial autocracy. On the first sign of political dissent, Africa's new leaders referred to the colonial autocracy they were familiar with, a tendency that has characterized the entire post-colonial period. Thus, when Africans in various African countries protested the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020, they were not just expressing solidarity with African Americans and African immigrants in America. They were also protesting local acts of police violence, such as the killing of 16-year-old Tina Ezekwe by police officers in Nigeria, or residents of the Kibera slum in Nairobi who chanted, "Stop killing us." In enforcing lockdown during COVID-19, police and soldiers had killed several individuals in the cities of South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. I end my lecture by discussing briefly with posters how the young generation of African artists in their 20s and 30s are responding through their work to the histories of violence on both sides of the Atlantic. I will illustrate through the work of Sela Kojo-Ejei of Ghana, a product of the College of Art of the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, and the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in Accra. Through his work, we see the themes of slavery, neo-slavery, Black imprisonment, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, with violence as a connecting thread. These are exhibitions in Ghana by an artist trained in Ghana, who lives in Ghana and has never visited America. But the diasporic leitmotif is evident. It is said that a picture speaks 1,000 words. A few images from Sela Ejei's series on Echoes from the Past, 2016, Usutu Usutu, 2016, mounted with co-artist Kwame Akoto-Bamfo, and Hunter Hunted, 2017, will underscore the above-mentioned themes. I've also included a sculpture by Kwame Akoto-Bamfo entitled Inchim Inchim, which is at the entrance of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. He has created striking sculptures depicting slavery and the slave trade on both sides of the Atlantic. So, Usutu Usutu, this is an art exhibition by Sela Kojo-Ejei and Kwame Akoto-Bamfo. And they seem to have used for their poster pictures from the civil rights struggles. The one with I Am a Man is supposed to be from Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee, and the photo is credited to photojournalist Ernest C. Withers. This is the installation at the entrance of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, done by a Ghanaian sculptor, artist, Kwame Akoto-Bamfo, who is also doing incredible depictions of slavery and slave trade in Ghana. These are two exhibitions by Sela Ejei. The one, Echoes from the Past, speaks to gun violence. As you can see, the guns present in this. And Hunter Hunted, to the right, we have returned to Malcolm X, who has become an important icon for young African artists in their 20s and in their 30s. So let us conclude. I have traced over more than half a century the changing relations between Africans and African Americans from the period of African independence. A key theme has been recent African immigration to the United States and the increasing assumption of Black racial identity among the second generation of African immigrants. We have seen as an example the responses of the Ghanaian government to these developments, as the government has sought to retain its hold over Ghanaian immigrants and to cultivate ties to the older African diaspora through a two-pronged strategy. To the frustration of African Americans resident in Ghana in the 1990s, government departments like the Ministry of the Interior insisted that new legislation such as the Dual Citizenship Act of 1996 did not apply to them, despite the pronouncements of then President Rawlings. Dual citizenship was intended for the new Ghanaian diaspora and not the old African diaspora. They were directed to the right of abode facility. But over the years, there have been important shifts in the relations of the Ghanaian government to the old African diaspora. In 1999, PANAFEST included in its Emancipation Day events rituals of remembering and atonement for African participation in the Atlantic slave trade, a radical shift in a society that did not openly discuss slavery. But it was clear that Ghana could not encourage African American tourism to the slave castles without acknowledging its complicity in the slave trade. In September 2018, the current president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, in Washington, D.C., formally declared 2019 as Ghana's year of return, encouraging the return of the old African diaspora to Ghana in the year that observed 400 years of African American slavery in the United States. In July of 2019, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, led a congressional delegation from the United States to Ghana, which included several prominent African American congressmen and women, such as the late John Lewis and the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Karen Bass. A key stop on their trip was a visit to the slave castles of Cape Coast and Elmina. So here you see the entire group to the left, and in front of what used to be called the door of no return, which was the exit point to slave ships, is a photograph of Nancy Pelosi and the late John Lewis. As part of the year of return, President Akufo-Addo in late 2019 granted Ghanaian citizenship to 126 African Americans and 34 Caribbean Africans, something that had remained elusive since the Dual Citizenship Act of 1996. I have argued in this lecture that perhaps one of the motivations for this has been the blurring of the lines between the old and new diasporas in the shared identity of global Blackness, and the realization by the government that an endeavor to retain the loyalty of second-generation Ghanaian immigrants cannot be divorced from overtures to African Americans. It is worth noting that in 2019, remittances from abroad, according to the World Bank data, amounted to 4.3% of Ghana's gross domestic product. Dual citizenship has now become a strategy to attract the linked diasporas. As Blackness ceases to be just an American category and assumes global dimensions, this may open room for the redefinition of the meaning of Blackness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Akyeampong. What a brilliant lecture. Thank you for helping us to explore in greater detail these changing relationships between Africans on the continent and African Americans in America. We are ready to begin our conversation with a few questions and comments. And the first one comes from Angela Adai, who is a professor in the law school. She says, "Thank you for your lecture, with the increased popularity of intercultural exchange, i.e. Ghana's Year of Return, literature by authors such as Yao Jaisi, and the popularity of Anakra fabrics, and Black Americans, how might the old and the new diasporas leverage global Blackness to advance social justice and economic development?
Okay. There's a sense in which we see it happening already in very interesting ways. So in Ghana, we are seeing young people lead new institutions or organizations, fighting for economic justice, fighting for a welfare understanding where that makes a distinction between growth or economic growth and economic development where issues of parity are important. And so we are beginning to see interesting arguments. I think one of the movements I'm beginning to see in terms of how global Blackness is being used to advance social justice is something called the Basic Income Grant, BIG. It used to be believed that you don't give a man a fish, you teach a man to fish. That way the man can take or the woman can take care of themselves indefinitely and you don't need to keep coming back. But increasingly in both developed and developing countries, there's an increasing appreciation that sometimes it's not because people don't want to work. Sometimes it's because the jobs are not just there. And when the jobs are not just there, how do you teach a man to fish? And so arguments are being made and insights are coming from places like Mexico and other places about how perhaps the government should commit itself to giving every citizen some modest amount that ensures that you have the capacity to earn some kind of, to live decently. And we are beginning to see countries studying this happening in the North and beginning to implement them. So 3 countries are experimenting on this. South Africa is one. Botswana is a second. Namibia is a third. And it's about giving a little money each month. Doesn't matter whether you've been trying to get a job or not. Almost as if the need for a certain minimum decency of living requires that. So here we are beginning to see changing notions of unemployment, of looking for a job, of social justice. Insights coming not from Africa. These are insights that have come from the North, but that are being applied. And so increasingly, we're seeing around the Atlantic such waves of ideas and influences that are being adopted and modified in ways that work. I would like to see this go beyond South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, especially on a continent where things from graduate unemployment and things have reached levels in youth unemployment. It's not like people are not looking for jobs. So we are in a continent where the informal economy is much larger than the formal economy. And it raises important implications of social justice. We tried lockdown. We decided that, lockdown doesn't make sense when 2/3 of your population need to go out every day to earn a living. When you can't stay home because you don't have electricity and you don't have a refrigerator to store food. And as governments tried to lock down, the realities of trying to do that in terms of logistics. So if anything, we all will come out of COVID with a deepened appreciation of the need for social justice and to create opportunities where as many people as possible have access to some kind of decent life. So that is the basic income grant is a specific example about how all new diasporas, global understandings, ideas that are coming to Africa.
Wonderful. Let's shift the question or the context from transnationalism to what's happening on college and university campuses in terms of collaborative engagements between first and second generation Africans and African Americans. What have you seen and what are you seeing on college campuses with respect to these kinds of engagements and activities, especially with respect to the issues of social justice, policing, curriculum, Black studies programs, African American and African studies programs, ethnic studies programs, and the list goes on and on?
Okay, that's a big question. There is a sense in which I guess I've been at Harvard long enough to see different snapshots over time. So I've seen Harvard in the early 2000s, so about 20 years ago. I remember when I was encouraged to teach a core course in history, which would be a required course for graduation. And I asked myself, if I had captive students, what would I want to teach them? And I actually decided to teach them about slavery and slave trade in Africa and the Americas. Not an easy course to teach. And then we had these large constituencies, but the constituencies kind of broke down into different groups. So we had African students from the continent. We had African heritage students, so second generation Africans. We had African Americans, and we had Europeans and white Americans. I was not aware that they had come to take the class, but there had been silent resolutions that the moment that I made a comment that any group considered derogatory, they would walk out of the class as a group. I never knew that. But knowing the seriousness of the subject, I treated each lecture very seriously. And so they kept coming back week after week through 14 weeks. And it was at the end that I learned that there had been these resolutions. But then the students also began to approach to talk to me. So I found out that the African students from the continent sometimes would cast aspersions on African heritage students who couldn't speak the language of their parents. African Americans worried that African students and second generation students seem not to know much about the civil rights struggles and things like the affirmative action and things that had opened up opportunities for everybody, including Emmanuel Akyeampong. And one day, one of the African American musicians came to my office to express his concerns about that. And his concern was if the shoe was on the other foot, would Africans open the door to African Americans? And my response was that you need to teach them about the civil rights movement and about African American history. They didn't just end here in a vacuum. And they also need to teach you more about Africa so that you appreciate that Africa is more than safari and this and that. And so we should see more conversation. there was an incident about 2 years ago at Harvard of police brutality against an African student, a West African student. And it was bad. And then all of a sudden, there was conversation about, it doesn't matter whether you have no history of racial relations when you come from Africa. As Chimamanda says, you are now in America, you are Black. And so it was actually decided that the Center for African Studies, which I chair, as part of orientation for new students who are coming from Africa, should begin to sort of give them a sense of race relations in America so that they are not that clueless. I have seen these push and pull over curriculum, over programs to do with prison visits that a colleague of mine was central in building. We've seen it around the demand for a program in ethnic studies, which is ongoing at Harvard. And so these issues also come to inform curriculum matters, whether in the form of an absence of a program that they would like to see, or sometimes a program that exists. So we have African and African American studies, and this year we've had all kinds of interesting conversations. And one of the things that African graduate students have pointed out is their desire, especially, to see female African scholars in terms of faculty, people they can relate to. So sometimes a program might be there, but its representation in terms of faculty might be an issue. Sometimes a program does not exist, and it's considered important because it reflects the lived realities of students who are at Harvard. And they want what they study to have meaning to how they live and how they experience life. So all these are ongoing, and they are here.
So let's continue just a little bit deeper with this issue of curriculum when it comes to issues of Black studies or African studies. And this question comes from Professor Sharice Cheney about the diversifying of academic offerings. But before I read her question, I want to say that the government of Ghana should probably pay you a finder's fee, because one of our professors, Bruce Barrowman, offers this comment, said that I don't have a question, but thanks for such a wonderful lecture. I was so pleased to see the references to Malcolm X and all the new insights. Fantastic lecture. Thanks so much. I want to visit Ghana. So
yes,
finder's
fee.
And from Professor Cheney, thank you so much for your thought-provoking interventions on conceptions of Blackness that revolve around African Americans. How does your work speak to the need to diversify our understanding of academic offerings in Black studies programs, like what we are embarking upon here at the University of Oregon?
Okay, so over the course of today, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of several meetings. So I've had, different perspectives about what is going on. And I think that the question is, in terms of a desire to see something happen in Black studies, I've heard enough from the administrators through the students to see that there's a desire for that. How then does one move forward in terms of either diversifying academic offerings in Black studies? And I think one of the things I've said in my meetings is that you begin with the faculty you have. But what you do is to encourage conversations between faculties who are not in conversation, often putting resources to grease or lubricate or facilitate those conversations. When I came to chair the Center for African Studies, one of the things I did was just do an inventory across the 12 plus schools at Harvard. I visited, I did research. Everyone who had a teaching or research interest on Africa, I reached out to, I met in groups or individually. And then what I did was to find resources or find money to encourage conversations between faculty who should be in conversations because their fields are speaking to each other or their research interests are speaking to each other, but they are not speaking to each other because we tend to be siloed in our research. And to encourage the putting of resources at those junctures to perhaps inform novel courses that are co-taught, that explore areas that neither would have ventured into because they don't have all the expertise to do that. That is how I began to teach courses on African psychiatry with Arthur Kleinman. And we've taught this since 2006 with a strong following. We've even come up with textbooks that we have edited, etc., etc. So that is one. But there's also the reality that the faculty you have will not cover the entire landscape you want to explore. And so another important thing I have done was the bringing in of fellows or scholars as visitors who brought expertise that we lacked to bring perspectives into a conversation that we wanted to have, but we didn't have all the voices. We couldn't play all the notes. And that became important. And we did that in conversation with deans like Michael Smith then, that as this happens, as sometimes they join in co-teaching, we are able to establish where there is demand in terms of subjects, in terms of this and that. And that could later inform where and how we hire. So we began to do that. So a whole cluster of courses that were not taught joined what we were doing. And what was interesting about them was that they crossed disciplines or crossed fields, raising questions because they were being co-taught by colleagues who had complementary but different skills. And we found out that there's student demand for that. Indeed, at Harvard, often what challenges faculty to invent ourselves is not because we got up one day and decided we want to do something new. It is our students. Our students lead us in directions we don't want to go. And then we follow tentatively, and then amazing things happen. But what I'm beginning to see is a shift. You talk about diversifying academic offerings in Black studies. What I'm beginning to see among our students is a focus with problems and how to address problems. And sometimes they are not looking at it necessarily within an area-specific focus. So if it's about cities and how to look at cities from interdisciplinary ways, if it is looking at migration, but doing it in ways that even crosses regions. So how to create these synergies around faculty who ordinarily would not teach together, but who are connected because they are asking similar questions, but in different areas. I think that is how synergies are created in ways that are very attractive, not just to our students, but it encourages faculty in directions that are fruitful for our own scholarship. I always say that there's nothing new in a field. What becomes new is because you went to some other field and brought something they are doing into your field, and everybody says, oh my goodness, where did that come from? But it wasn't completely new. Your field just didn't ask it in that way. And I think in that direction lies a lot of what could be fertile and productive in terms of diversifying academic offerings in Black studies.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. So moving on to our question that kind of links to that, but takes it out broadly again. From Papa Jaisi, what is the significance of the historical nomination of Wale Adeyemo, son of Nigerian immigrants, to the important job of Deputy Treasury Secretary in the evolving identity of global Blackness?
Indeed. And I read that notice and I smiled. We have a vice president-elect whose mother came from India. And we celebrate it because it reflects what America has become. The Secretary for Homeland Security, I like the name because it's different. I like the idea that someone from Africa, and West Africans have always been good with money, will be placed as the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. What America has become is that, and there is a sense in which the America that attracts the African immigrants we've been speaking about, they have come because it's always been this land of opportunity that gives opportunity for things to happen. And when I see appointments like the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, it confirms that it is still possible for that to happen in the United States. That is what explains why individuals like myself are still here so many years after graduate school, when we thought we were just coming to graduate school, though we have found very concrete ways to link what we do also to what happens on the continent. So I think it's a step in the right direction. It is a reflection of what America has become, irrespective of whether there are people who refuse to see it or who would like to pretend that is not so.
Well, we're going to move on from that great response in terms of thinking about the complexity of national identity to the issue of identity as it relates to our students on campus. You mentioned earlier the important role that students play in moving us in directions that we didn't think about going, but are important for the university. And so Selena Simpson, one of our leaders in terms of advising a philosophy PhD at the University of Oregon, offers this question. Thank you for an engaging and thoughtful talk. I'm hoping you can speak more to the push and pull of white supremacy and Blackness and how to help students navigate this. On the one hand, you touched on the role of white supremacy in forming a Blackness that expands beyond the United States. And on the other hand, there's very clearly a cultural exchange, growth, reclamation, joy, and connection to be found in this expansion as well. As someone who works with undergraduate students in the midst of an important time in their identity development, how can we help students navigate the pain of white supremacy and the joy of Blackness? How do we also help Black students navigate diversity in Blackness without relying purely on their context of white supremacy for commonality?
Okay, I get all the big questions today.
You certainly do,
Okay.
and you're handling them quite well.
Okay, let me share some thoughts on this. Next semester, I'm going to be based in Cape Town, South Africa. One of the key reasons I want to do that is because I have a daughter in 5th grade. And I want to give her the opportunity of at least attending a semester in their formative stages in school on the continent of Africa. I do that because I stay in a part of the US where I often am the only Black person at meetings, or one of a handful. And my daughter is often the only Black person in the classes she has been to. At most, there might be two, rarely two. In a sense, I am pointing to the importance of study abroad and how study abroad. There was a year that Harvard decided that every undergraduate must have an international experience. And through funding from the Rockefellers, we were able to provide funding for almost every undergraduate to have an international experience, either over the summer or over January term, 4 months, if you were not too bold to go for a long summer. I think it is important to make study abroad, or to make opportunities to be on the continent important. When it comes to Blackness, one of its strictures has often been because its meanings have been imposed on us rather than being defined by us. So when first generation African parents are discouraging second generation African immigrants from overly associating with Black American culture, etc., is because they have a very narrow understanding of Black American culture. And they think of inner city and this and that. But if you were to look at American history in its broader scope, or African American history, it's a history of amazing creativity. So even within that, as I pointed in the lecture, there's always been diversity in Blackness. I think that we need to have more intra-Black conversations. And for me, I think what is exciting is that that is happening not just in this country, but it's happening even on the continent of Africa. And where most people are Black, sometimes you don't think Blackness would be important. But as I was showing through art, both the creative and the performing arts, they are beginning to engage and to interrogate Blackness in very interesting ways. And I think that what my hope is for Blackness to find a way, and I'm seeing that already, to escape its mooring in the United States. And for Black people across the world then to have the opportunity to define Blackness in ways that are affirming, and to have some of that come back to shape the way we think about Blackness in the United States, because the United States does not exist in a vacuum. So for me, two things. One is the opportunity for people to visit the continent, either for programs or study abroad, summer abroad. That is important. Let them go and come back having had an experience and formed opinions of the continent that are divorced from stereotype and that are divorced from media. And two is to have an intra-Black engagement or conversations. Because even among Black Americans, there's great diversity. And for that to begin to speak to us, just like I told my African American students in that slavery class, you need to teach the second generation Africans about American history and about the civil rights struggle. And I told the Africans, you need to tell them about the Africa you come from and the Africa you know, that it is more than wild animals and safari. There is a sense in which we need to not just embrace Blackness, but we need to take authority over Blackness and its meanings. And that is where I would like to see us go.
Profound, this notion of taking authority over Blackness and its meanings, and what that means for this campus, not only in terms of the development of Black studies, but our relationships with one another and with others beyond Blackness. Thank you so much for leaving us with a wonderful closing inspirational thought. You've been with us since early in the morning, and now it is almost 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
In Massachusetts. We appreciate your stamina, your extraordinary contributions to our engagement and our intellectual thought on this campus. And we look forward to remaining in touch. Thank you again and have a good night.
Thank you and good night as well.
President Schill, closing words?
I just wanted to thank you also. It was a wonderful talk and, just provides enormous food for thought, both about the conversations we're having in our own university, but also in our country and world. So thank you for joining us. You're welcome anytime to come here. Next time, we got to get you actually here in Oregon. Next time.
I look forward to that opportunity.
Have a good night.
Same.